All right, my name's Matthew Gillikin. I'm one of the co-chairs of Livable Seville. Livable Seville is an all-volunteer group that advocates for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods welcoming to all. And I want to give each of you who are here an official, if you don't already have one, an official housing nerd badge because you have come to deep in the weeds when one becomes interested in housing. You might become interested in zoning. And if your eyes don't glaze over too much, you might find out about this thing called inclusionary zoning. And then you have another set of choices to make of whether or not you want to figure that out. And so you have really gone hard. So congratulations to each of you. You're officially a housing nerd if you weren't there already. So before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to talk just a little bit about inclusionary zoning in Charlottesville. So inclusionary zoning is basically the idea that when new housing is built, some portion of that housing is set aside for income restricted units for affordable housing. Or in some cases, the developer is required to pay a fee that is typically used for affordable housing. So that's kind of the basics of what inclusionary zoning is. And Charlottesville's new zoning code, it's the first time Charlottesville had a true inclusionary zoning part of its zoning code. And we were able to do that because in 2020, Delegate Sally Hudson got enabling legislation passed by the General Assembly that was signed by the governor that allowed us to have inclusionary zoning in our zoning code. That was not something Charlottesville previously was able to do. So in most of the city, the inclusionary zoning requirement is that any development with 10 or more homes in it or 10 or more units, 10% of those units have to be for people making 60% of area median income or below. So 10% of units, 60% of area median income or below for 99 years. So it's kind of an indefinite, practically an indefinite term of saying that any new housing built, any building with 10 or more units will have 10% of those homes be affordable for 99 years. The developer could also, in most of the city, instead of the on-site units, pay an in lieu fee. The in lieu fees were intentionally made very large so that people typically wouldn't pay them and instead do the on-site units. However, there's also a second part of the city, which is anywhere within a half a mile of central grounds or campus, depending on the nomenclature you prefer. That if it's a building with 10 or more units within a half a mile of UVA's campus, and that rents by the bedroom, which is the typical format for student-focused housing, though not exclusively for student-focused housing. In those cases, they cannot provide on-site units to meet the city's requirements. They have to pay an in lieu fee. The fee is designed to be the gap between what a market rate unit would cost to build and what an affordable unit would cost to build. So it works out to about $200,000. So instead of 10% of the units having on-site, they would pay the equivalent of what 10% of units would cost to build that with that market gap. So think for 10% of units in a building, each of those have to instead be a payment of like $200,000 to $250,000. It depends on the size of the unit. So that's the quick version of Charlottesville, what our zoning code requires for inclusionary zoning. The city is currently considering whether or not to provide a tax abatement to help offset the lost revenue that comes with inclusionary zoning requirements of on-site units. So when someone builds a building and there's on-site units, the revenue they will get from the affordable units will not be as great, which may make some projects not work out financially. So to help us think more clearly about this, we have Michael Andersen, who's the Director of Cities and Towns with Sightline Institute. Since 2006, he's been writing about ways better municipal policy can help break poverty cycles with a focus on housing and transportation. His work before joining Sightline in 2018 included reporting and editing for print and web in Longview and Vancouver, Washington, Portland, and Portland, Oregon. He lives in Portland, has a cat, and he told his wife on their first date that he's not really a bike guy, and he's sticking with that. So we're a safe space, even if you're not a big bike person. That's okay. Kelly Brown is the director of the City of Charlottesville's Neighborhood Services Department, overseeing the city's housing division, comprehensive and current planning, transportation planning, building inspections, property maintenance, zoning, and historic preservation and design. She has 20 years of experience as a community development professional and planner in both the public and private sectors. Previously, she was a comprehensive planning supervisor in the Arlington County Planning Division. Her career has also included consulting work for real estate and economic development clients. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Spanish from Georgetown University, a Master of Community Planning degree from University of Maryland. I'm told she's a Mumford and Sons fan and that she has a strange cheeseburger candle in the city offices that her son bought her. So we are going to turn it over to Michael, and then we'll hear from Kelly, and then we'll be able to have some Q&A. Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matthew. I will uh, talk for a few minutes about this, and then I'd be happy to listen to Kelly and take questions. I don't know, are we going to do questions in between or just in a big run after?
Mainly we'll do them kind of at the end after Kelly's talked.
Okay, perfect. Great. Thanks a lot. Well, thanks a lot so much for the invitation to be here. As Matthew said, I'm sitting in Portland, Oregon right now. The light may fade as I talk to you, but it's still late afternoon here. Um, so Portland has been through a journey on inclusionary zoning, and I am exactly the kind of nerd who found myself drawn into the thick of it. So I've been part of trying to figure out what is going on and what things we should do to adjust to our lessons. So this is my summary of things that I have concluded from that experience. I'm happy to talk more about that and as we go on. First of all, I'll start by just talking about my employer. Sightline is a regional sustainability think tank. We are based in the Pacific Northwest. That's our territory there on the right. So up to Alaska through British Columbia and all the way down to the North California coast and over to the Great Divide. I'm a policy writer and researcher. I focus on housing. Since that bio, I've added a kid to that cat, and that's fun too. And one thing that Sightline believes is that cities are good. We think that cities are good for our economy, good for our environment, and good for our society when people get to live close to each other. So once you think that cities are good, once you decide that, you might you tend to be led inevitably to the conclusion that homes must be good. And so I'll summarize sort of where I'm coming from normatively with this study just from last year. Came out then, and here are a couple findings from this 25 study. Market rate housing development will undoubtedly help alleviate the housing affordability crisis at the city or regional level and at the neighborhood level. New subsidized housing development helped slightly more than market rate construction to alleviate displacement and exclusion. Or to summarize the summary, market rate apartments are good, and subsidized apartments are also good. And in some ways, they're even better. So with that as context, the it's great that homes are good. I love good things. The problem with good things is that they cost money. Homes are also expensive, and specifically, it's very expensive to subsidize homes. This is an Oregon figure. I don't know what it is in Virginia, but public subsidy per LIHTC home, the sort of most common form of unit-specific subsidy here in Oregon, it costs about 300 grand per unit to bring something down to the 60% AMI level, whereas the public subsidy per market rate home is, of course, nothing. Now, this is not to say that we should only ever have market rate homes. It is to say that it costs a lot of money when we do get the second thing here. So we should be doing everything we can because, again, both of these things are good. We should be doing everything we can to get the second thing while not getting in the way of the first thing. That's how we maximize the amount of good going on. So that brings us to inclusionary zoning, which is one way of trying to achieve the goal of both good things. Here's a simple summary of how it works. If you imagine a 100-unit building and you imagine that 10% of the homes in that building are set aside at a below market price, then you have a mixed income building, and that has lots of great social effects. This is a study that caught my eye from a few years ago. I think the thing that inclusionary zoning does it's better at than any other tool in the sort of standard housing toolbox is it's good at creating mixed income neighborhoods, specifically in desirable areas. It's not the best thing at creating affordable housing. It's not the best thing at creating market rate housing. It's not the best thing at ending homelessness, but it is the best thing that we have specifically for creating mixed income communities with affordable housing, like price regulated housing in them, in desirable areas, if it's done right. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to do it right if you want to use that tool for that purpose. In 2016, Portland created an inclusionary zoning program. It was fully funded in the central city, and it was underfunded in surrounding neighborhoods. So when I talk about funded versus underfunded, I'll go into that in a little more detail for a bit, but the basic concept is you say, let's come up with, when we want to fully fund a program, let's come up with a package of offsets, tax abatements, fee breaks that have the same fiscal value as the losses that we expect this building to take relative to a fully market rate building. And once you do that, again, I'll talk about this in a bit. Once you do that, you're essentially keeping the building more or less whole. And from the perspective of the third party investor who's deciding whether or not to make the building exist at all, then it looks the same as if it was a market rate building that they might invest in some other location. If you can achieve that, then it's a fully funded program. If you have an underfunded program, that means there's some sort of deficit, there's some sort of loss that each building is taking. And I'll talk about the consequence of having a partially underfunded program here in Portland. So underfunded inclusionary zoning, what happens is illustrated here. If you imagine a building that doesn't have any price restrictions on it, might cost this much, and the rent might be this high, right? The rent isn't just arbitrarily set, it's set by what people are willing to pay. And what people are willing to pay is based on what they can get across the street or down the street or next town over. So the rent in older buildings determines the maximum price that somebody can charge in the new building. Maybe that new building is a little nicer, so maybe they can charge a little bit more, but for basic intents and purposes, the rent in the new building is set by the rent in the older building and controlled that way. The effect of any price control or any sort of cost increase on that new building could be, you can think of it this way, the cost of that lost rent. If we say you can only collect a certain price, from a certain number of the homes in the building, that's like saying, basically, here's an additional cost. On top of building the building, you have to come up with the money to subsidize the rents in those below market homes. So the lost rent essentially adds to the price of the building. This is the same phenomenon that takes place when you say you need to build 10 more parking spaces or you need to add a balcony on every building. And sometimes these costs are legitimate, but they do add costs. When you add costs to a new project, what doesn't happen is you just get the new building for free. What happens is that the developer tries to get people to move into that new building at that higher price because that higher price is what it takes to get the building built. And it turns out nobody wants to move into that building, and so the building doesn't get built at all in that situation until price goes up. Because when people are moving into the community, the prices will go up as they compete for the homes that exist. And once that happens, eventually the prices get high enough in those older buildings that the new building also fits with that additional cost. This is how many, many years of development have gone in the United States, is we've come up with more and more ways to add to the cost of developing something. And we've waited for the rent in the older buildings to go up. And then eventually the new buildings can afford to cover the cost of that. So inclusionary zoning is just another form of that phenomenon. And if you look at this closely, you'll notice that the only people, it's not just the people in the new building who are covering that higher cost. It's also the people in the old building, in the red zones, who are paying higher rents for all of their buildings than they were before because the rents went up before that new building could be built. And that is exactly what happened in Portland when we had an underfunded system. Buildings stopped being built at the previous rates. This is the year that the program was introduced, and then the number of homes built in Portland quickly fell off as people were unable to make that additional cost of complying with inclusionary zoning work as they tried to build buildings. Here's the effect looked at in a different way. This is the expectation of growth when the program was created, and this is the actual number of below market homes that we got out of the program, because a program that doesn't produce mixed income buildings also obviously doesn't produce as many below market buildings as you would hope for. It does produce some, as I mentioned. Eventually the prices rise enough that they can support that, but it's only after the prices rise that that happens in an underfunded IZ situation. So if you think about that gap there on the right, what does that represent? In Portland's case, it's about 1,375 missing affordable homes. It's 50% less tax base growth from the new homes that didn't exist, otherwise would have, that we would have hoped would have existed. And it's thousands of unbuilt market rate homes, which, to call back to the first slide, are also obviously something that helps us mitigate displacement and promote inclusion, as well as just housing people. So not a great outcome, I would argue. Here's one of the most obvious consequences, sort of a canary in the coal mine, is you had projects like this one that had 13 units that were just below the 20 unit threshold that the program was applied to. Somebody broke their project into 13 different buildings, none of which were 20 units, and so resulted in 219 homes, but no affordable units. Obviously, this is a lose-lose scenario. When this happens, it's not the intent of the rule, but when you have an underfunded program, you're incentivizing people to bend over backwards in this way, underbuild their zoning, and avoid the program, because it's sort of a situation where you can lead a horse to water but can't make them drink. There's no way to force somebody to build a building that loses money. That happened not in that exact way, but in different ways over and over through the city over the next 7 years. So before the mandate was put in place from 2012 to 17, 12 to 19 unit projects, just below the threshold of that 20 unit mandate, were a little under a quarter of all projects in the city. And then as soon as the mandate came in, it went to just under 50% of units in the city and remained that way until 2024. But from 2017 to 22, there were no check-ins on the program. There were no evaluations of like, is this program in balance? Should we make any adjustments? Finally, the city council did decide to do an evaluation of how the program was going in 2022. And that led in 2024 to a proposal to fully fund Portland's inclusionary zoning program. So we used a 10-year tax abatement from the future buildings, so the buildings that were not previously being built but will be built under this fully funded program, to fully offset the lost rents. And at the same time, prioritize 60% AMI homes in higher priced neighborhoods, where before you could qualify with an 80% AMI home, which is pretty close to market rate in a lot of cases, and so doesn't deliver a ton of public benefit. So it sort of tried to focus inclusionary zoning on the thing that inclusionary zoning does best, again, creating mixed income buildings. The first sign that I heard that this might be working as we hoped was from this dude, not a social justice warrior, but this is his LinkedIn post where he was excitedly at the very top of his LinkedIn post promoting that this site that he was trying to sell was eligible for this inclusionary zoning program. This is absolutely not the way anybody would have marketed a site before the program was fully funded. But now, because we had made these changes, he was like, yes, you have the chance to build a mixed income building. It's a great deal. That's a sign that the market is buying into the concept, it seems to me. In those first 6 months after the change, we had 20 projects opt in, 1,500 homes, 120 or more were below market, and the waived revenue was $220,000 per 60 AMI home. If you remember my previous slide, that's quite a bit less than the public's cost per LIHTC home. And so that's also pretty important to me, is that if we were spending a ton of money on this program per below market home, it might not be a great idea, but it's actually a better deal on a per unit basis than the entire LIHTC system from the taxpayer's perspective. Here's another example of a building that went up using it, 69 homes, 7 of them below market, 154 with 16 below market, both of these opting for that 10% at 60% option. And then in the aggregate, I think this is the single best indication of the program working as intended. The share of homes, of buildings rather, that are just below that 20 unit threshold has gone back actually a little bit below normal, that it's a little bit less common than it was before the program to be underbuilding your zoning. Is a pretty good sign that the program is in fact in balance and people are actively opting into it. The market is being directed towards this public goal successfully. Other places that are moving away from unfunded inclusionary zoning include Washington State, Florida, Baltimore, Illinois, and Greater Paris actually has been had their inclusionary system has been like this from the start, as I understand it. So it's not I would say a universal way to do the program, but it is an increasingly popular way to think about and structure your programs. So I can wait for questions till later, but that's the quick version of Portland's journey, and I'm happy to hear more about Charlottesville's.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. I'll turn it over to you now.
All right. Thank you very much. And just going to make sure I get the sharing of the screen properly sequenced.
As complicated as developing a good inclusionary zoning program is correctly sharing one screen on a Zoom call in 2026.
It might be. All right. Are we all set? And now are we all set?
Yes, we are good to
Okay.
go.
Great. So before we get started, I'll just say, introduce myself. I am introduce myself again, but most importantly, clarify that the hamburger candle actually is no longer in my possession. It has been gifted to a member of my team who was very excited to receive it as part of our white elephant gift exchange.
Oh, okay. Kind of an employee of the month now.
I'm Kelly Brown, Director of Neighborhood Development Services for the city, and I'm happy to provide a brief overview of the city's current efforts to study the potential for a tax abatement program to help address some of the concerns about the feasibility of housing construction with the inclusionary zoning requirements. So just by way of some background, the overall study purpose went back to some interest from council in looking at this tool and deciding that it really would be best to have a consultant help us to figure out the feasibility. So the consulting firm 3TP Ventures was brought on board to do this work for us. They did a great job and really are the experts on this topic. I'm going to do my best to convey some of the messages that they have recently shared with our council and are contained in a report that goes into much greater detail on our city webpage. But the overall study purpose was to first of all evaluate the current housing market construction feasibility, really establish a baseline for whether or not housing is truly feasible in this day and time, given the challenges and constraints in financing and the cost of construction materials. And then with that baseline understanding, also evaluate the financial impacts of inclusionary zoning. So how do those requirements impact the overall feasibility of projects? With those understandings in place, our consultants took a look at a couple of different types of tax abatement approaches, including something similar to what Portland has instituted, and looked at how a tax abatement program could impact the feasibility of programs. In doing this study for us, something that the consultants created that we're really excited about is actually a tool that we used for this study to evaluate feasibility, but that we can also use in the future to evaluate Other potential interventions, public sector interventions to help make development more feasible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those pieces of the study. Oopsies, there we go. Also, by way of background, Matt, you mentioned some of these things already, but this work, these requirements for inclusionary zoning, they do go back quite a ways now to an affordable housing needs assessment conducted in 2019, which really demonstrated a need for new housing. There was a new code adopted in 2023. And so while the city commits a lot of funding to affordable housing on an annual basis, these market rate projects have really been slow to materialize. So as I've already mentioned, the purpose of this study was really to try to figure out if tax abatement could be a strategy to address that need. So a definition of tax abatement, just for, again, since we're all housing nerds here in this forum, I'll just spend a minute talking about what tax abatement means in the Virginia context. So it is a temporary reduction or exemption from taxes that are levied by the government, and it's typically to encourage a particular activity, in this case, the production of affordable units. It really is intended to kind of improve the financial feasibility of development, but you're still preserving base tax revenue. It's authorized under state code. However, in Virginia, just a nuance is that a tax abatement program has to be executed as a performance-based grant. So we can't abate taxes up front. We have to provide kind of a reimbursement after the fact through a grant. So just a detail to understand the Virginia context. So I mentioned the tool that was created to look at the baseline feasibility of housing market construction. And something that was really great about the work the consultants did was they worked very closely. There was a lot of outreach to members of the real estate community, to developers, to folks in the construction world to get a strong, firm grasp on what are the costs, what are the revenues that we're seeing in the Charlottesville market. And so this tool that they created is something that kind of mirrors what folks in the private sector would use in pro forma analysis to determine feasibility, but it has levers built into it to analyze the impacts of public intervention. And so one of the levers that we're testing through this model is the impact of a tax abatement tool. And this is a little bit more about what the interface looks like. This is also something that's available on the city webpage. If anybody wants to play around with it, it is publicly available for anyone to go in and change inputs, change assumptions. Anytime you change an assumption, change a potential public intervention, it will inform for you the feasibility of a particular type of project. Red means it's probably not feasible, yellow means maybe, and green means, yeah, it's probably something that could get built. So I'm not going to go into all of these numbers, all these assumptions, but that's the general principle behind this tool. So the questions we explored were, first, what is the feasibility of a typical project today? What does that inclusionary zoning policy do to feasibility? What do incentives do to change that feasibility? And then how does this impact city revenue? So the initial set of findings was, again, to just figure out, what are the current conditions? And what the tool demonstrates is that in this current market, construction feasibility is limited. So there's really no product, if you look at everything from a high rise to a townhouse to single family, that today, in today's market, is considered feasible. And then we looked at what is market feasibility with inclusionary zoning. With and without inclusionary zoning. So sorry about that. The first screen showed what feasibility looks like with inclusionary zoning. So I'll try to go back if I can. Right. So this is feasibility with inclusionary zoning, and then this is without inclusionary zoning. And the results are essentially the same from a project feasibility perspective, although the IRR and the yields do improve. So what that really means is that, again, in today's market, if you want something to pencil, you either need to find a way to lower the cost or increase the revenues.
And Kelly, I think some people might be wondering, and I know some further work is going to be done on this, but this study did not particularly address student-focused housing or buy the bedroom rentals, correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. This study did not tease out student housing specifically. Those questions of student housing are actually much more recently emerging in the public discourse. So this study, yeah, didn't look at student housing as a different typology. So the two tax abatement methods we tested were first a value-based abatement, which is considered a more traditional form of abatement where you're really looking at abating the taxes on it's based on assessed values, and you're abating taxes traditionally just on like the units that would be produced that are affordable. And then we also looked at a different method, which is something that I think is somewhat similar to what Portland is doing, although curious to hear Michael's perspective on that. And we're also seeing it in Baltimore. It's an abatement calculated based on the gap between market rent and affordable rent. So what we found was that both types of abatement have a positive impact on project feasibility. But when you're looking at value-based tax abatement, that abatement return is lower than the rent loss. And this really is the same for any market that you're looking at, whether it's a lower revenue market or a higher revenue market. And so it moves the needle, but really not very much. Now, the rent gap model does a better job of improving feasibility. So if you end up abating 100% of taxes, 100% of what's actually lost between market and affordable rent, a project could potentially become feasible. It's more of a city investment, but again, this is tax revenue that you wouldn't otherwise see if a project didn't get built. So the rent gap tax abatement approach does merit some consideration. This is just kind of a summary of the pros and cons of these two approaches. One of the concerns with the rent gap abatement is that it's kind of a newer form of abatement. Baltimore was the only study that our consultants had identified where this approach was being used. So there's some questions about what sort of requirements we would need to put in place to continuously monitor that difference between rental market rates, market rents and affordable rents, for example. But again, it could be a more productive form of addressing the feasibility concerns associated with inclusionary zoning. So at the end of the day, bottom line, market conditions are challenging today. And inclusionary zoning does add to that challenge. Traditional tax abatement can help, but it's really only one piece of the puzzle. Rent gap tax abatements, something that really are worth more consideration. But still other incentives are probably going to be needed to make many projects work. So I think with that, I have wrapped up as well. I'm looking forward to questions, discussion.
Great. Thank you both. And so folks, the Zoom seems to have changed their chat settings in ways that are annoying. You can either direct chat me or send a group chat now to everyone. If you have a question, please send questions. But Michael, I'm kind of curious your reactions to seeing how many housing types in Charlottesville might not be market feasible right now, and how you kind of think about market cycles and how designing inclusionary zoning programs should be aware of that.
Yeah, this comes up all the time in Oregon because we're in a similar situation where the population is not growing as fast as it was in the teens, and the prices have been flat for 5 years, which is a great thing in lots of ways. We don't have the displacement crisis at the nearly the pace that we did in the teens, but it also means that we don't see the results of the various changes we've been trying to make it easier to build housing until there is that need, right? Um, the way I've been thinking about it, and this comes up in almost every conversation about inclusionary zoning here, is it is not the public's responsibility to make your project work, right? Like you, the developer, I'm sure you would love to make that happen, or you, the property owner, I'm sure you would love to find some way to do it. But sorry, that's not our problem. Our problem is to make sure that our program is paying its own way, right? That we're looking for balance. We are not looking to solve every development problem in the city of Portland with our inclusionary zoning program. We're looking for a program that brings no net harm to that viability of the new project. And so the we are in a similar situation where the total number of projects being built is much smaller, but as I said, it no longer seems to be distorted by our inclusionary zoning program. It's one developer I talked to said we're still uh, 200 yards behind the starting line, but we're closer than we were before, right? And so like she was like more or less this inclusionary zoning is not dragging us further from being able to produce these homes. And her takeaway from that was she was on the committee that came up with this and in conversation with lots of other interest groups as well. And she was like, this is good. This is what we want from this program is for it to not harm our thing. And I love to produce mixed income buildings when it can pencil.
Um, that's great. So, next question is, let's get, kind of think for Michael and Kelly both. There's kind of a concern. I know this kind of comes from like the budget end of things. The people who count the money will talk about maybe the risk of over subsidizing, that we're reducing our income from new development by providing abatements of various forms. Um, what about the risk of under subsidizing? What are kind of the downsides and which obviously we want to hit the sweet spot, but that's not really how policy works. That's not how development works to hit like the exact right dollar amount. So I guess Michael and then maybe Kelly, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on it of like what are the potential downsides if this if Charlottesville doesn't look to abate to offset the costs correctly.
You want to go, Kelly?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that's why the work that our consultants did was so insightful because it looks at a variety of different tax abatement approaches and clearly shows that there are some tax abatement approaches that don't really do very much to move the needle. Um, but then there's other approaches like the rent gap abatement approach. And certainly if you're um, abating 100% of that lost revenue between what you would earn through a market rate project and an affordable unit, you're kind of getting to that sweet spot. So I think that the study really presents a number of options for decision makers to consider, and also how those different approaches can affect overall project feasibility.
Yeah. So all of development is a game of horseshoes. The developers, the reason there was just a question about like what is the rate of return required to pencil, and the rate of return is what I need to offer somebody to make them invest their money in my project rather than the S&P 500, right? And if I'm a developer, that's what that is. I am constrained by that market pressure, right? I cannot get somebody to invest their money in me if they can get a better deal from just putting in the stock market or wherever else. So, um, the sorry, I lost my train.
I think just the kind of the question around what
Oh
are
yeah,
the
we don't know
downsides
exactly
of,
what. Yeah, yeah, okay. So, like you said, Matthew, there is no precise right answer. What the city of Portland, at least, should be doing, in my opinion, is trying to aim towards the horseshoe pole, right, or whatever it's called, and trying to get the beanbag in the hole. But you're not going to get it exactly every single time. Some projects are going to be on this side of the line, some projects are going to be on that side of the line. There are winners and losers in every policy. We're not going to get it perfect. Either we don't try to do this policy, which is legitimate. Not every city should have IZ, I would say, or we try to do this policy and it's imperfect, but it helps. It accomplishes more or less what we're trying to get done.
okay, great. Michael, could you describe, I- my understanding is, so Portland did a particular approach to tax abatements that's different from the sort of rent gap model, though kind of like philosophically has the same aim of fully funding. Could you describe what Portland did and how that differs from the rent gap slash Baltimore model?
Yeah, so Portland's version is even more a game of horseshoes, I would say. And it's so like basically, as Kelly was describing for the valuation model, we used a valuation model for our studies both in 2016 and 2023. Both of them made the same conclusion. This program is slightly better than fully funded in the central city and underfunded outside the central city. And then the new model said but it's somewhere between the range of 80% and 120% for a variety of different building types. As long as we hit that range of offset, we're calling it good, which I think is fair. So the and that's a stab in the dark. That's based on assumptions about a discount rate for the developer will use a discount rate to calculate the net present value of money and essentially predict reasonable assumptions about the future. But that may be wrong. And it will be wrong, probably. We just don't know in which direction it's going to be wrong. So, what I love about the Baltimore approach, personally, I've been an evangelist for it, is that there's a lot less uncertainty and it also gives the government the option to sort of monitor, well, how big is this rent gap 20 years from now anyway? So in Portland, we have a variety of other circumstances mean that we're trying to condense many years of tax abatement, many years of subsidized rent. We're trying to pay for many years of discounted rents with just the first 10 years of the building's life. And so that requires additional like predictions about the future that we absolutely do not have confidence in, but just have to take a stab at. Whereas the Baltimore approach, if you can do it that way, logistically, it lets you have an ongoing relationship between the tax abatement and the gap between the market and controlled prices. And it's something you can sort of see if that gap is worth all your time and effort every single year. And if it's not, then you can drop it and cut some of your administrative costs from a pretty administratively fussy program.
And Michael, so Charlottesville is doing 99-year terms. Some people have said, wow, that is too long, not because they're opposed to the idea of long-term affordable housing, but because it screws up. It's a real
Yeah,
fly in the ointment of financial models. But I believe, does Portland also have a very long term?
it does. And
And
that
I
has
guess
been
what
very
do you think
controversial as
99
well.
year, is that a problem necessarily, or do you think what
I
are your
would
thoughts on
personally
that?
say it is unreasonable to expect a building to even be here in 99 years for sure. And
Okay.
in theory, like if this building lasts 80 years before it's fallen apart, in theory the future owner is going to owe the back rent on or like the difference with interest for all of those years if they demolish the building, which would be like an unrealistic thing for somebody who owns a falling apart building to come up with that money, right? So, um, I think it was basically put in there uh, aspirationally with a we'll solve that problem when we get to it. We're going to get as much affordability out
Mhm.
of this as we want to. And uh, I would say 99 years is a little bit too long. Yeah.
Okay. And I think, if I recall correctly, Baltimore has kind of an off-ramp that it gave itself at like the 30-year mark, where the city can choose to be like, hey, we're good now. The administrative costs of doing this aren't working for us or something like that. Is that correct?
Kelly might know better than I do. I do not know that question.
Okay.
In Baltimore,
Yeah.
I don't know actually.
Okay. I feel
Yeah.
like I'd read, maybe I'd read somewhere that at the 30-year mark, the city can opt to no longer have those requirements because, at least in theory, the gap between the market rate and the affordable units would have decreased enough that the administrative costs for the city would out be greater than what the benefit for the city would be.
Hmm.
Right. And you
Um,
can imagine a system where there's a check-in and like a renewal of like now you get another tax abatement based on that new calculated gap, and then we're working with more information at the 30-year mark instead of trying to guess at the full duration.
um, Kelly, what are the next steps for the city with, so the market studies occurred. What'll be happening now that that's happened?
So we had a really good work session with council, presenting this presentation with a little bit more detail on Tuesday evening. So we are processing the questions they asked us, some of the feedback they shared. And I envision us developing some options for what a program could look like in Charlottesville, what the pros and cons might be, and bringing it to council for their consideration. It's kind of where we are at the moment. You alluded to that, or you mentioned that student housing has a unique placement in our policy. So we are also looking at student housing right now and whether our expectations for student housing are correct. So that might also feed into some of our recommendations moving ahead. But we're kind of still in a space of trying to consider what really makes sense for Charlottesville, given what we've learned so far.
Okay, do you have a sense of the timeline for when that might happen? Is that a 3-month thing, a 6-month thing?
I
It's
don't have a
TBD.
timeline right now. I'm sure it's something that's all fresh in our minds, and we're all very eager to do what we can to um, get the housing that we've been looking for a long time. But I
Yeah.
don't have a specific time frame right now.
Okay. Michael, you mentioned that Portland is starting to find that the investment it's making to produce these affordable units through inclusionary zoning is turning out to be a lower public investment than what's happening through, I guess, typically LIHTC projects, low-income housing tax credit projects, for those housing nerds who don't know that term yet. And I think Charlottesville is kind of in an interesting place where we're, among other things, confronting the need for LIHTC projects to be fully parked, which means we're running into high costs with structured parking. I guess is we're just really trying to figure out things. I guess we got LIHTC kind of being the biggest dog in town, and it's a not a well-functioning thing in many respects in terms of the requirements. And then you've got inclusionary zoning, which I think is a potential tool. Are there any other options? So like it often gets thrown out in Charlottesville. What about sort of social housing or publicly funded housing that I guess doesn't use LIHTC? But I guess is there any other things that we should know about in terms of good ways of generating income restricted housing um, besides the an IZ or a LIHTC, or are we stuck?
Right. No, you're certainly not stuck. So, um, one thing that you absolutely have is you've got people with Section 8 vouchers, right? So there are a bunch of people with a subsidy that's based on their income, and then that covers gap between what they can afford and the market price of a market rate home, right? So it's essentially turning a market rate home into a subsidized home, but the person gets to choose where to go. Obviously, the landlord also has to accept them. That's a whole thing. And there are lots of other complications. But if you were just trying to subsidize housing for the most people in need, that's probably the tool for the job, right? And so there are some places that have supplementary funding for vouchers, and they say, well, if you're getting a voucher, we're gonna help underwrite the local housing authority distribution of vouchers so that more people can get these vouchers because many people are on a wait list for those in almost every location. Um, the
Okay.
Another thing we do in Portland is we have some property tax bonds that fund site-specific homes, and generally those are then mixed with LIHTC funding to help both the LIHTC dollars and the local dollars go further. Um, that has its own upsides and downsides too.
Okay, that's helpful. I think the problem that Charlottesville has is that there are so few rental vacancies here that voucher holders have a terrible time finding a place in the city limits. The city has actually, for a few years now, I believe, used its supplemental rental assistance program to fund vouchers for city residents who actually end up living in the surrounding county because of the lack of housing. And we hear stories from homelessness service providers of they will get really excited about, oh, we found a place that will take vouchers, be able to rehouse some people, but then they are almost, I've heard this multiple different times. It's actually because the people that were there previously were voucher holders that were evicted for whatever reason, or or low income. And so it's just this like cycle where our lack of rental housing, broadly speaking, is creating these huge barriers for voucher holders. And that's, I think, one of the points of where like market rate housing is part of the solution because most voucher holders are actually in most markets accessing market rate homes. And I think sometimes that
Yep.
gets a little misunderstood. Um, Kelly, I'm going to ask this question knowing you're going to give a super diplomatic answer. But Albemarle County exists and surrounds us. What is, what are some opportunities for the city and county to work together to improve the affordable housing supply in our area?
So, what I would say is really, I think, a recommendation for any jurisdiction, and this is not going to be news to anybody on this call, right? But building more housing and providing ways to subsidize housing to reach the lowest levels of affordability, the highest levels of affordability, the lowest incomes. I think those are two policy choices that any jurisdiction in the country right now should be pursuing. It's not news to any of you on this call, but I really think that's the solution, or at least one way of tackling the problem. Because yeah, the truth is we are a very small jurisdiction in a much larger region facing a lot of pressure, housing pressure. So
Okay, great. We're gonna wrap up here and I'm gonna give people, I want to put two things in front of people in terms of ways they can be involved in some advocacy and also learning. The first is a super cool webinar we're gonna have on March 30th with Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear from the War on Cars podcast. I just put a link to sign up in the chat. They wrote an awesome book called Life After Cars, and they are going to be joined by local e-bike dad and New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie. For Jamel to share a little bit about what he envisions for life after cars in Charlottesville. So you can sign up for that free webinar. That's on March 30th. And then the other thing I want to put on people's radar, and ties very much with city and county, is on Tuesday, March 24th. Impact will be holding its annual Nehemiah Action Tuesday, March 24th at 6:30 at MLK Auditorium at Charlottesville High School. Impact is the interfaith social justice advocacy organization here in Charlottesville. They do awesome work. They've been tirelessly advocating for affordable housing and better transportation in our area. This event is great. All you have to do is show up and be part of the crowd. Your presence there is part of showing the power of people. There are usually well over 1,000 people there. And it's a super cool event. There are local elected officials there, and they're asked to support priorities that are identified by Impact. This year, the priorities will be affordable housing, transportation, and public safety. So put that on your calendar, Tuesday, March 24th, 6:30 at MLK Auditorium at Charlottesville High School. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all of my fellow housing nerds for joining us on this rainy evening. And I hope you all have a great rest of your night. Take care.